Welcome to Module 3, entitled Demand Management in an Outsourced Omnichannel Environment. You'll note right away from our title that this module is different from Module 2, in which we studied demand management, but from the perspective of a U.S. manufacturer that imports raw materials. This is different. It's an outsourced environment using an omnichannel distribution model. Let's see what we have here. For our objectives, we have 4. Much like we did in Module 2, albeit in a manufacturing environment, we will study the impact of omnichannel distribution on demand management. Second, we're going to look at demand management within the framework of outsourced production. This is really the theme of the entire module, looking at third-party manufacturing, planning, and control activities. From there, we will identify the links between demand management activities and a U.S. import program. And then we'll introduce a concept that we'll deal with in greater detail in future modules, but this is entitled Sales and Operations Planning. Our agenda, consistent with that list of objectives, is the following. An introduction to outsourced manufacturing. We're using outside people to do our manufacturing on our behalf in support of our omnichannel distribution program. We'll bring definitions, as we often do, in this case omnichannel and demand management defined. We will look again at manufacturing planning and control, this time in an outsourced model. We'll analyze in some detail forecasting, supply chain planning and execution, and of course, that introduction to sales and operations planning. This opening slide provides a bit of a history lesson as it relates to U.S. manufacturing models, outsourced production. Since the 1980s, the U.S. has been on an ever-increasing trend towards outsourced manufacturing, sometimes referred to as contract manufacturing. Those two terms, outsourced manufacturing and contract manufacturing, not exactly synonymous, but close enough for purposes of our studies. But the point is, for the better part of 30 or 40 years, the U.S. industrial base has shifted towards manufacturing overseas. That has a huge impact on demand planning and subsequent supply chain activities. This phenomenon has been especially predominant in industries with high labor content of a semi-skilled nature. Access to cheap labor is really what things come down to. As a quick programming note, and it's very important to say this explicitly, whereas many companies still import raw materials and manufacture in the U.S., as we saw in Module 2, the balance of this module is dedicated to analyzing importers that outsource that manufacturing of finished goods to support their omnichannel distribution. We're finished for now with a manufacturing model where we import raw materials and manufacture. Now it's outsourced and selling out into an omnichannel distribution environment. If you studied Module 2, you will recognize these slides as a summary of what we spoke of in that Module 2. We want to reestablish the conversation and point out some of the arguments in favor of outsourcing. The first bullet point is probably the biggest, in that outsourcing allows companies to focus on customer-centric core competencies. We will recall this term core competencies from our previous studies, and it simply means that companies can focus on what they do best, on what is most attractive about their value proposition. In most instances, those companies focus on product development, the customer experience, and certainly sales and marketing. But manufacturing is outsourced. One of the financial benefits, especially from an asset perspective, which are found on a company's balance sheet, there's no need for factories, plant, or equipment. So all of that money that would have otherwise been invested in factories and plant can now be dedicated to those core competencies. Last bullet point on this slide, reduced fixed costs. And we will recall that a fixed cost is an expense that we incur whether we sell one item in a month or 1 million items in a month. Fixed costs are typically associated with those factories. Depreciation on the factory, insurance, a certain level of payroll. In an outsourced environment, we're reducing those fixed costs. Continuing on with our summary of arguments in favor of outsourcing, and consistent with this idea of reducing fixed costs, that outsourced model allows for variable production costs, meaning that we only pay for what we have our overseas vendors, our overseas manufacturers make for us. If we contract for 1,000 units, we pay for 1,000 units. production, as we see in our first sub-bullet point, is based on demand. And demand is a reflection of the orders, the purchase orders, we place on our overseas manufacturers. And of course, the price we pay, the expense that we incur, is based on the number of units produced. And the number of units produced is driven by how many we order. That's an important distinction. Variable production costs are very attractive. As a company that doesn't manufacture, we will also have a lower investment in inventory, at least as it relates to raw materials and work in process. Mainly because we don't need that type of inventory because we're not making anything. We're only dealing with finished goods. We, of course, have to manage the amount of finished goods that we contract for with our overseas vendors, but that's a different story we'll get to a little later on. And finally, lower labor costs for us because we're not manufacturing anything. We don't have payroll related to manufacturing. Also, the prices that we pay for the products we buy overseas are a result of those lower labor costs that we find in other countries. A quick summary, but many of the benefits associated with outsourcing. And once again, we are talking about, in this module, outsourced manufacturing and an omni-channel business model. We did say a number of times that we would see this slide on numerous occasions, and we're not going to disappoint. It's really an important slide. In this context, we're looking at the main challenge of outsourced production, what we like to refer to as the decoupling of buy-side and sell-side functions. We've explained the definitions of buy-side and sell-side sufficiently, so we won't go into that too much here. But we will say that this decoupling really splits right down the middle of this slide. And by decoupling, we mean that we as the importer are no longer in direct control of manufacturing. In our previous module, we were the manufacturer. We were importing raw materials. And as such, we were dealing directly with raw material suppliers on the buy side of our supply chain. That's entirely different now because we're using third parties to engage in that activity. What does not change is that everything starts with our customers, and of course, a reflection of customer demand or projected customer demand in the future, a sales forecast. We still have to develop a forecast. We still have to convert that forecast into purchase orders for given finished goods on our overseas vendors so they can go out and acquire raw materials, so they can engage in manufacturing and then get goods back to us. The message here throughout the entire module is this idea of decoupling buy side from sell side because we're not making anything anymore, but still having to manage many of the processes associated with what we have come to call, and that we'll see again, manufacturing planning and control. That is the fundamental message of this module. Let's wrap up this section, our first of Module 3, by providing a definition of omnichannel distribution. Omnichannel describes the multiple ways in which both individuals and companies can research, select, purchase, and/or return merchandise to a seller. When we talk about individuals buying goods, typically in a store or even online, what's referred to as B2C, business to consumer. And then when a company sells to another company, that's called B2B, business to business. We'll get more into those models in the future as well, but we did want to make that distinction now. The real key here is identifying the ways in which either individuals or companies can purchase and/or return merchandise. And as you'll see in our sub-bullet points, there are many ways in which buyers can do that. First one, buy online and have goods delivered to a home or office. That's pretty basic these days. Select goods at a store, go physically out to a store, and have them delivered to a home or office. That's not unusual either. Lots of people will go out to a store, a showroom, essentially these days, see the product, touch it, perhaps have an experience with that product, and then go home and purchase it online. A newer facet of omnichannel is to purchase online and then have goods drop shipped directly from a manufacturer, either domestically or internationally. This is a little new because drop shipping, as the name implies, means that yes, we as a buyer will go online and purchase something, but it won't come from a warehouse. It won't come from a distribution facility of the seller. It will come directly from the manufacturer. That could be domestically in the United States, or in a more complex scenario, even sent internationally from Asia, from Europe, depending on where the goods were originally made. That's fairly new, so it adds complexity to this omnichannel model. A couple of other options related to omnichannel is for an individual to select a product online and go pick it up at a retail store, a brick and mortar facility. Something that's a little bit newer is for a customer to buy online, and even though the customer doesn't necessarily see this, the goods are shipped from a retail store in close proximity to the buyer. This is actually better for the seller because they can reduce their own shipping costs. Instead of sending goods from a DC in Nebraska to a customer in Atlanta, if the seller has retail stores in the Atlanta area, they can receive the order online, process the order online, and then ship it from a store that is close by to that customer. Again, that's fairly new. And finally, purchase at a store and return, typically by mail or small parcel from home or an office. It's important to say that this definition, these examples, are not exhaustive in terms of the multiple ways in which buyers can research, learn about, purchase, and or return goods, but they do represent probably 90%. It's an ever-evolving type of situation, omnichannel, so we're never going to be able to capture every type of variation of the model itself. Okay, that's it for section 1. When we come back, we're going to redefine demand management and talk about demand management in this outsourced environment. Please do return as quickly as you can.